Washington lands another big fish. 4-star wide receiver Chris Lawson's in the boat.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He's site editor with Athlon Sports Inside the Huskies. I'm the site editor with Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen today, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKDOWNCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Now, Lars, big news. We said in the opener, 4-star wide receiver Chris Lawson at Archbishop Riordan High School in the Bay Area has committed to Washington. And this is such a nice get for Jedd Fisch, for Kevin Cummings, for this entire coaching staff, because, they've suffered a couple of losses on the recruiting trail. Wide receiver was the one where, it feels like they've gotten a lot of their top guys between, especially him and Rylon Dillard-Allen.
Oh, no doubt. And I think that was kind of the thing that we expected, where the fact that you could cast such a wide net and get, Andrew Marson for a visit, get Philip Ellen for a visit, knowing that probably they would go elsewhere, but it's still a matter, just it says one thing to get a visit. And now people will say, well, Chris Lawson didn't have an Oregon committable offer at this point, but Oregon absolutely was still looking at him. Now, just did he end up waiting too long or whatever the case may be, who knows? But you're still going in against some of these premier teams for elite level talent, and that's what Kevin Cummings needed to do. I remember we talked with him during the spring camp, and he's like, "Oh, the standard here is pretty obvious. Like, I don't have to beat around the bush. It's we already know what the standard is. Like, I know Shep was a great recruiter, but this is also where, like, okay, we both wanted Shep to stay on staff if possible, but ever since Kevin Cummings has come on staff, he has kind of just been not that we've forgotten about Shepard because we both love Shep, but Kevin Cummings has made that transition a lot easier going into Arizona via Florida to get Vinesbright. Goes and gets a couple other guys, obviously Deji in the class, but this is one where you really need to get a couple more 4-stars. So you add Chris Lawson with Braden Vinesbright, and maybe we'll talk about in the second segment. Do you find one more in this class down the line in a flip? Potentially, maybe not. But if you don't, these are two solid receivers that you can start to build out the class with Deji again as a 3-star, who we both think probably could work his way into a 4-star potentially. Certainly is a worthy take in that regard. But getting 2 4-stars at the top of this class, you can look and say, this is what I'm going to build off of. And it's a perfect situation for Washington moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And these guys are both super complimentary of each other. When you look at Braden Vinesbright as he transfers to IMG, he's somebody who is expected to be one of those burners, one of those guys that can really stretch the field. And while he doesn't necessarily have what I would consider elite size, especially after, we've watched Denzel Boston spring camp. We got to watch Roma Dunze for the last couple of seasons. Like, we consider that like the T. Higgins level. Like, that's elite size, but he has good size for what he's being asked to do. And he's built really, really well. And I feel like you could say the same about Chris Lawson. He's a guy who I think he's going to thrive in the short to intermediate areas of the field, as somebody who, when I watch his film, I think a lot about DJ Moore and what he's able to do, and not necessarily in terms of, play style, where I'm not going to compare him to an all-pro NFL receiver. Like, come on. Like, that's way too high of expectations for a guy who hasn't even played a senior season of high school. But it's something where when I watch his play style, I look at his body type, I think that that's something that he's able to emulate in his play, where when I watch DJ, I see somebody who does a lot of those same things. And yeah, he's able to get open down the field, which Chris Lawson's able to do as well, but he's just elite with the ball in his hands after the catch. And that's something where I think that Jedd Fisch is going to find a whole lot of ways to utilize him in the offense, where he's somebody who, he's going to thrive in just getting the ball in his hands, a la Jacob Cowing, a la Dorian Singer, where it's, we're just going to find ways to scheme you open. We're going to get you some space, and we're just going to let you go. Where he doesn't run nearly as well as Braden Vinesbright does, where, it's very hard to find guys who do that. But he's somebody who I think can be a guy who averages 10, 11, 12 yards a catch at some point during his college career, just thanks to what his abilities are and what his strengths are.
I completely agree with you there. One thing that intrigues me about Chris Lawson is we're kind of looking over some numbers for him. Also runs track. And I think that's something to consider when you're looking at wide receivers, guys that have breakaway speed. that there's one thing to be, you have track speed where you don't have pads on, nobody's actually chasing you aside from guys that you're running against. But it tells me, okay, this is a guy where once he gets into the open field, he can find a second, third, fourth, fifth gear. That's, I think, the difference where some guys, they're more of a possession receiver, where, to your point, you can go over the middle, but you can't actually turn a 15, 20-yarder into a touchdown, right? We saw Jalen McMillan do that a lot over his time at Washington, where he takes some of those over-the-middle routes and then turns on the Jets. Now, he didn't have the same breakaway speed that Rome Odunze did, but all these guys, to your point, are complementary, where we saw for a little bit what Jedd Fisch's offense could potentially look like at Washington. Obviously, we know what he did at Arizona, but I'm sure he'll tweak things a little bit differently. But you can still see there's a specific, and we've talked about it at basically every single position. There's a specific type of receiver that Washington likes, and there's a couple, and we've seen them add all those guys in this class where you don't want to just take 6'4", 6'4", 6'4", because okay, they might have the height, but maybe they don't necessarily have the speed. Where, think about, again, our favorite concept here is mesh. Just imagine all, Raiden Vinesbright, Chris Lawson, Desi Ajose, and just throwing Audric Harris from a guy who's already on campus. Just imagine, and again, all these guys are interchangeable. Just imagine that quad of receivers. 4 different types, all guys with speed, and that allows the offense to do so many different things. And so when you look at the body type, for me, I think that's what I like to see, because we saw, you get Desmond Roebuck in, you get Deji as a tall guy. You wanted one more kind of true X receiver who could also still play inside. And I think Chris Lawson is that perfect fit. Now, obviously, we talked about some other guys. Would you like them too? Sure. But I think this isn't a consolation prize. I want to be clear. This is a guy that they wanted, and this is kind of a guy you would want to build your class around, and you can just compliment off of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Where I like where you're going there, especially with the top 3 of where Desmond Roebuck, I feel he's a little bit harder to project just in terms of where his body is right now and where he might need to be in, a year or two. Where when I look at the top 3 and I look at Chris Lawson as somebody who, I don't know if he'd necessarily play the X full time, but as somebody who, because Desi Ajose can certainly be that guy. And as I said, Raiden Vinesbright is somebody on the other side of the field who can really stretch it and do a whole lot of different things. And then it's just, as you said, it's nice complementary pieces that play off one another, which is something that we saw Kalen DeBoer's offense, when it was functioning at such a high level last year, do so well. And it's something that we saw Jedd Fisch's do at Arizona with Jacob Cowling, Dorian Singer, Tyrone McMillan. All these guys found ways to complement each other very, very well. And I think that so much of their success is in a way going to be defined by the scheme, where I think they're all incredible players. And I think they're all really fantastic gets for Washington. But I think that Jedd Fisch's scheme has done such a good job over the years that it's about getting this high level talent in there with all these guys. And that's exactly what this is, where it's going to be a combination of scheme plus talent, where we've always seen that at Washington, where they get really nice talent, but the scheme really, really helps at such a high level. And especially the last 2 years being the prime example of that. That's something where Chris Lawson, who's now the 3rd highest rated member of this class, is somebody who, I don't know if I expect him to play a lot as a freshman, but it's something that the more I watch him, the more intrigued I am by him in this scheme. And Lars, that being said, let's get some of the other members of this class. And we'll get there right after a message from our good friends over at Game Time, because Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch, which is so great because I use Game Time all the time. I used it in Boston. I used it in Seattle. I love using it to get tickets to any baseball game that I want to attend this summer, because I just love seeing different games as I sit here in my Felix shirt. And, shout out to them. The Mariners need to start scoring some runs here pretty soon, because there's so many different ways that you can save money on Game Time, like last minute deals where you can save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and so much more. They got all-in pricing. You can toggle this feature, and it shows you total upfront with no surprise fees at checkouts. And they got seat views where you can get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. You can take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. So Lars, as we look at this class, Chris Lawson makes 21. And then I'm not going to go ahead and count them in the class, obviously, because things can change between now and their announcement. But Rylon Dillard-Allen, the safety from Arizona, and cornerback Larue Zamorano out of California, both also have crystal ball projections to choose Washington. If both those guys join up, all of a sudden you're at 23. And we know this is going to be a bigger class. I still think there's room for a couple more guys, but how many more prospects can, without even adding Rylon Dillard-Allen and Larue Zamorano into this conversation, how many more prospects can this class take?
I would say I'd put the over-under at 5.5, and I would take the slight under. Because when you look at who's still on the board, you're not going to take, this isn't going to be a 30 class. You're not going to get that high. Now, the only way I guess you could get that high is if you have attrition after the season. But I think in that case, they would go for the portal versus adding more guys in the high school class, especially given who they've already taken. Well, I'm saying given who they've already taken. In terms of, no offense to them, if you look at Desmond Roebuck, if you're going to take him, I doubt you would take a transfer portal receiver to make 5 receivers in a class in that regard, especially given who you're losing, who you've already had coming in, because the other thing you have to consider is look at how young the roster is. I think that's the other side of this equation. Do you want to continue adding more youth to this roster? Or now, again, we all know that Jedd wants to run and to play freshmen and do things like that. But at some point, you do kind of have to stagger out your roster in terms of experience, where if you have a class of 30 guys or 25, 30 guys, that's a lot harder to stagger out in terms of, or you're either going to play most of them or you're going to redshirt most of them. And then now that 26 class becomes smaller. There's so many ways to balance this class out. I think they'll probably take 3 or 4 more, maybe 5, but I wouldn't expect more than that.
So I hear you. I certainly agree that I wouldn't, put it over anywhere, higher than I want to say 27 prospects in total. So I might take the slight over there, but it's the same ballpark, right? But when I look at this, I do disagree where I think he would continue to build through the areas of high school recruiting. And the one thing that I want to say is I think that the transfer portal utilization might depend on who enters the portal. And with this roster, when you talk about attrition, who enters the draft and just where the talent might be lacking, where all of a sudden, if let's say, just hypothetically speaking, 4 of the 5 offensive linemen all of a sudden need to be replaced for one reason or another after the season. Yeah, you're going to want to hit the portal for that. Where, you can find, maybe a Pocky Finau and a Michael Watkins and a Justin Hilkema step in there, but you will still want to make sure you have some experience up front. But if you're looking in terms of, let's say, cornerback, where I could just defensive back in general, or I could certainly see a realistic scenario where you lose 5, 6, 7 guys, even maybe depending on how you look at it, between the draft and the portal. So in that case, I'd probably prefer to go in the area of high school where, you can add a veteran safety like you did in Cam Broussard, but you still want to make sure you find a Rylon Dillard-Allen, and maybe you want to go and all of a sudden you can make a late push for one of these top corners before they sign. Where you've talked about flips before, and we're going to certainly get more into that. But I think that there still might be 6, and then so much more of this is going to come from the high school recruiting range, where Jedd's talked about it being an 80-20 split, where it's all about filling in when it comes to the transfer portal. Just, we're right now, you look at the class and you see 3 linebackers. Maybe that 4th linebacker, in terms of the 4 that are coming out, maybe that 4th one does end up coming from the transfer portal, where that's a way, or maybe that's why you took Hayden Lowe a little bit later on in the process, or excuse me, Hayden Moore. I got my recruiting names mixed up there. But when I look at a guy like Hayden Moore, that's somebody where all of a sudden that can kind of, dissuade you from taking another guy in the portal or taking another guy in terms of high school, because that's somebody where you want to see how that plays out. Where that's the best example I can give on the roster right now. But when I look at it, I still think that they're going to push, and then you've talked about it, and I know this is something that you have really strong feelings on. It feels like some of those spots might be reserved for guys that they try to flip before a signing day, which is something we've seen this staff do there at Arizona.
Exactly. And one guy that comes to mind is Matata Goai, where you mentioned safeties. That could be a perfect resolution where you don't go into the portal and you take a top end 4-star who ends up, who already has made an official visit. Now, again, I'm not saying he's going to flip, but I'm saying that's where I would agree. Okay, take those guys in the high school ranks instead of going into the portal, because maybe you don't have a Cam Broussard come out or find a Justin Harrington in that regard. And if you think about, as you were saying all that, because I don't disagree in that regard, but I think it might be more position based, where when you look at running back, for example, you could lose Jonah Coleman, Cam Davis, Sam Adams. You could lose 3 or 4 running backs. Now you did bring in 2 and Adam Muhammad and Jordan Washington, along with Julian McMahon in the 25 class. Do you add one more in the 25 class? Do you go to the portal? So I think it's more by position now, and which is why I agree with you. For the most part, you want to take those guys in the high school ranks. Like I said, like a Tagoai, if Ladarian Coyote put out his top 10 on Sunday or Saturday. So if you think about if he were to add his name to the class, that's another guy where, hey, another 4-star safety, don't need to go in the portal for that. The problem also, though, is in that same regard, one thing we talked about heavily in the first couple months, January, February, March, the secondary is so young. Do you want to continue to make it younger and younger and younger? No, yes. Again, as we keep saying, Jedd wants to play freshman, and cornerbacks coach John Richardson hasn't been afraid to do that at Arizona. So I can certainly see that being the case, but that's also where those last 3 or 4 spots might be reserved for guys in the portal if you're not in that elite, 4-star range as a high school player, because you can take a 4-star high schooler or a portal guy. You don't want to be settling, oh, hey, we're going to take this guy from, Utah State. No shame there, given the third segment that we're going to talk about. But just using a smaller school, non-power 4 school in that regard. Okay, you don't want to flip those guys. So if the flips are legitimate to go, if you're able to get Smith or Rogbo to come back around, if you're able to get Chase Sims to come back around, there's certain other guys. Because again, defensive line, I think it's one where, you can make the argument for the portal, but I think we both would rather have that come from the high school ranks, where you can develop those guys for 2, 3, and 4 years versus just get a one-off transfer.
No, I agree. I didn't mean to interject, because defensive line and offensive line especially are the two that are so hotly contested in both high school ranks and the transfer portal that, when you look at just the way some of these takes have worked out, where I know you and I both really like Jake Flores. While he's rated as a 3-star, and honestly, shockingly, one of the lower rated members of this class, is somebody who has a 4-star offer list. Like you go through and you see Florida State, you see Michigan, you see a whole lot of really talented, just top to bottom rosters that decided to offer him a scholarship. And those are the kind of guys that, you look at, that it's really nice to get those from the high school ranks. And, getting a guy like him really early on in the cycle is nice. But then you look at somebody like Dominic McComb, where that's a guy who doesn't have a whole lot of offers, where you can get on him really, really early. And look at the battle that took place with Josiah Sharma. That's what defensive and offensive line battles have been like, with NIL, with the transfer portal for the last couple of years now. And it's not slowing down. So if you want to take a guy like that, no, I just wanted to agree that I see what you're saying there.
And I think that's where it's hard to project what that's going to look like right now, where I took a stab at it. I believe you've taken a stab on our respective websites about what the offensive line could look like this fall. Try doing that in 26 or 25, or not 26, 25. That's even harder, because we don't even know. Some of the freshmen and redshirt freshmen could progress, and that way maybe you don't need to. There's so many unknowns right now, where this class, the way that it's shaped up, is in a really solid spot. They're not hurting for guys. They're not saying, wow, we're short 3 bodies here or 2 bodies there. I mean, they pretty much checked all the boxes that they need to. Did they get all their top targets? No. Just be calling a spade there. But what the guys that they have gotten in this class, I think they're more than comfortable knowing, potentially, like we talked about earlier on, who could still join this class over the next month, that they're in a good position to go into the season and say, you know what, let's roll with this class right now. If we can add to it, so be it. If not, we'll go supplement it in the portal. And the other thing to consider, some of the guys that we're thinking maybe could go to the draft or transfer, if they have a really good season, they might come back. Similar to what most of those guys did in 22, if they buy into Fisch and they go 8-4, and it's, wow, wait, we could actually run this back and be 10-2 next season. Again, I'm not saying that would be the case, but I'm just saying there's a thought process that changes midway through the season once you actually see what's what, versus we're in July 6th, first week of July, thinking, okay, what are we doing here?
Right. No, I certainly see what you're saying there. And I just, the last thing I want to get in on just on this whole conversation is I'm really curious to see how NIL factors into all this, where it's not going to be reported on for the most part, because those are figures that we don't really have our hands on. And it's not just you or me or anybody in the UW media that's nationally. Those are figures that we don't have for the most part. And it's something where, as we get closer to signing day, I'm really curious to see if that plays a factor in, again, not just Washington, but nationally. If some schools are going to close really hard and just say, hey, we want to make sure we can secure you on signing day. We're going to offer you this much. I can see a reality where that happens, and I'm curious about it. And it's weird to talk about. It is. But that's something that I certainly want to keep my eye on. And Lars, speaking of NIL, Washington's got a pretty good one on the basketball side. Let's talk some hoops. So, Lars, Washington picked up a really, really interesting commitment late in the process because they're already working out. Basketball guys are on campus for the most part. And they picked up a commitment from a prospect from Ivory Coast who spent the last couple of years playing professional basketball in France, and that's Dominique Diomande, who, according to NBADraft.net, and they're really, really good at, projecting some of the earlier prospects in the cycle. I know some people here at .net be like, hold on a sec. But NBADraft.net is really awesome at projecting some of these prospects really, really early on, especially some of the overseas guys. He was projected as the number 48 prospect by them in this next draft class. And Danny Sprinkle got him to come to Washington.
He got him to come to Washington, as I wrote on Athlon Sports, and I'm sure you did on USA Today. Got him as what all indications are as a walk-on, because Washington is full of 13 scholarships. And this is where, as a perfect segue in from the last segment, this is where NIL comes into play. And now some people will say, wow, it's kind of cheap that you're gaming the system. Well, first of all, let's be something clear. He's a great prospect, but I think if there wasn't a extenuating circumstance, he would have already had a scholarship lined up somewhere else or whatever the case may be. So I think there's other kind of reasons why this was a late addition and why he's coming in as a walk-on. He's actually still in Dallas. He's not with the team right now. So I think that also kind of lends credence to, oh, he's a walk-on. He's going to, come in when he needs to come in that sort of deal. But it's also a player that you kind of have to do whatever you can do to get him, where if he wants to pay his own way, and because the other side of this is what I wrote on Athlon is there's two ways around this. If he's not a walk-on, it means somebody else is walking away from their scholarship and giving it to him to walk on. And there's really only two guys that could potentially check that box. One of them is Christian King, and I don't think, especially late in the process, Sprinkle would go to a player on his roster that's on scholarship and say, hey, I got this guy coming in from France. You want to give up your scholarship to let him on, and you can pay, your own tuition since you're an in-state kid. That's not gonna be good. Again, I did lay that out because that is the only other scenario which this would work, to be on scholarship. Otherwise, he's got to be on as a walk-on. And the other thing to consider, you mentioned he played professionally in France, means he's going to be coming over with some money. What's not to say he doesn't already have it in the bank account to, afford his tuition, and then is able to earn NIL on top of that. So this isn't a pay for play situation. This could be a guy where, hey, you know what? I want to play college ball. I potentially have a relationship with somebody on the staff. I have to imagine that's the case. And this could also be a potential, Abdul Gadi situation where we know he played professionally, both here and overseas. So there's all these relationships working in play. And let's talk about on the court, why this is such an important addition.
Yeah.
15 points, almost 6 rebounds a game, steals, a relentless guy on both ends of the court. I watched a bunch of his tape from 22 and 2023. Always crashes the boards.
6'7" with bounce, by the way. Yeah.
With Air Jordan bounce. Like, we're talking like Space Jam bounce. Like, and the other thing to consider, he is a very stingy defender in terms of he doesn't just put the hand up, use his height and things like that. He really goes not after guys, but he is not afraid to get up in your grill, but still be safe and still be responsible and still be smart. And a guy that's just turned 19 years old, I believe, with professional experience, he's going to be a wing player, to be very clear. He's a small forward, so he's going to play the 3. And when you look at the roster that Washington has, I don't necessarily know that they had a true, 3-and-D kind of guy. And if there's ever a 3, I mean, again,
they did.
They did, but did they have one like this?
Yes. Yes, in my opinion.
So I know, I agree. But I'm saying this is why having depth is important, because what did we see under Mike Hopkins? you could have one guy, but if one guy doesn't work out, this is why you have to do everything you can to build a roster to the best of your potential. And this is why we've been so high on Danny Sprinkles, because he will turn over any rock to find a guy.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the things that I love about this move, because I'll get to my somewhat dissent, but not really, so they know we're on the same page in a second. But that's my favorite thing about this, is that it's the exact same thing that Jedd Fisch said when he first came in. Is we're not in a position to turn down talent. We're going to find talent any way that we possibly can. And this is the perfect example of that. Whether he is on scholarship and somebody else is walking on, or whatever the case might be there, you found a way to get a really talented player on your roster, where he certainly still has a lot of improvement to do. Because I disagree. He's not necessarily a 3-point shooter where, from all the stats it showed, he's about a 30% guy from deep, but the guy gets the rim extremely effectively. The numbers that I saw is 71%, something like that on 2-pointers, which is mainly around the rim. He's just a real slasher, can get to the basket offensively, which is great. And that works. And especially with his athleticism, with what he's able to do offensively, that's fine. Where, you talk about a true 3-and-D guy that is certainly developing a more of an inside game as well. That's Tyler Harris, the Portland transfer, where I'm a huge fan of his game. I have some takes where I don't necessarily know how bold I want to get, where a couple months ago I put out a projected starting lineup over on Huskies Wire, where I talked about Zoom Diallo, Makai Mason, DJ Davis was in there, and then it's Great Osabor and Frank Capnon. I'm really considering moving a Makai Mason or DJ Davis out of the starting lineup and putting Tyler Harris in there, actually. And then it just kind of creates a little bit of a different rotation, in my opinion, with Diomande behind him. Because I think that this kind of changes just the whole complexion of what Danny Sprinkle wants to do. And if this guy can truly be as advertised, where, we've seen the film, we've watched all that, if he can make the transition to college basketball effectively, this just does nothing but add on to what we talked about whenever it was on the show 2 weeks ago, that this roster is ready to compete right now and can be one of the best in the Big Ten.
I agree. I don't think it changes anything. I think it expands what Danny Sprinkle can do. I don't think it changes it. I think the way that I've gleaned Danny Sprinkle's approach is he wants to have 3 or 4 different punches, where he can have the hook, have the cross, have the uppercut, and you now want to add I guess you love baseball so much, add a changeup in there, add a slider in there, add a curveball in there. Yeah, I got it. I can work many ways with this, the analogy there, but that's what it does. Is this doesn't say. And I think that's important to consider with this move to the Big Ten, because we saw what Sprinkle did at Montana State and Utah State. The roster he's already built at Washington is different than what he had at Utah State. I don't mean just by personnel. I mean by construction. You have a 6'7" center and a 6'8" forward with Great Osabor. It used to basically just be, Osabor is kind of an undersized 5, and you figure out, and maybe you play some small ball and things like that. Sprinkle's got about 4 or 5 different lineups to work with, and I think that's why he's doing this, is to come up with different punches for different teams.
So I certainly agree with you there, and that's kind of where I wanted to go with this. Is Great Osabor at the 5 at center can work at that level of basketball in the Mountain West. That's not going to work in the Big Ten, and it's obvious by who they lost in the tournament. They lost to Purdue and Zach Edey, where that's certainly a very unique situation there. But it's something that, when I think about what, and it's silly to think about, but when I think about what that Utah State roster might look like if they had a Frank Capnon in there, it looks a little bit different, right? And that's kind of one of the exciting things about what this Washington roster has turned into. And one of the exciting things about adding those two guys together, now adding Dominique Diomande with the Tyler Harris, and with this guard, just this whole pairing that they have in the backcourt, where I know you and I are both really high on Jace Butler. I feel like this might take him, out of the rotation, at least in the short term, where I like his prospect. I like his upside. I like what he does. But, you talk about Zoom Diallo, you talk about Luis Courtwright, DJ Davis, Makai Mason, all of a sudden the backcourt is looking a little crowded. And I think that he might end up as the odd man out for the short term, where, DJ and Luis are both in their final year eligibility. So I'm just really curious how he fits in that rotation, where, he's a top 100 overall player, 4-star guard that you signed from Illinois late in the process. That's all really great. And now he looks like he's somebody who might in the, this 24-25 season might be just not necessarily as utilized as he might have been before this. But I don't know, man. There's just, it points to what you said. There's so many different ways that you can take this roster.
And I think when you look at I looked at Danny Smickle's first last 2 years at Montana State, last 3 years at Montana State. Gradosworth came off the bench as a freshman and kind of as a sophomore too. So it's not necessary. And this is why you stack that talent early in. It's why you get multiple freshman guards to come in. So if Zoom happens to play more, he can come in with a little bit of a head start. But Jace is still right there as a redshirt freshman or sophomore, and this doesn't hinder the progression. So when you look at again, it gets back to the staggered procession that we talked about in football, where you don't want to have to go into the portal every year and recruit an entire new roster. You, especially at point guard, you want to have your floor general lined up so that they can already be in the swing of things and just know how to run the offense. And so you can put this complementary pieces around them, whoever they may be, but they are already understanding, hey, this is what Sprinkle wants to do on offense. This is how he wants to set up the defense. And those are the guys that when you're recruiting guys in the portal or in high school next year, you're going to say, hey, Jace, can you break down? Or, hey, Zoom, can you break down what we want to do here? Oh, no problem.
Yeah. Because
you already have those banked reps, whether they're in practice or games. And so I don't think it's a bad thing if Jace doesn't play
I agree.
more than 20 games this year, because I actually almost think it might be damning because you have so much veteran presence at guard. If Jace is playing a full season, we're talking either injury or something else happened that led to that being the case, which isn't a bad thing for Jace. It's just That's why you had so many veterans come in. That was the whole point.
It's clear that this roster is being built for the long term in that regard is the point.
Exactly.
Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all everydayers for tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We got so much more fun stuff coming for you throughout the offseason, and fall camp's closing in on us quickly. It'll be here before you know it. And just for all the latest news, just everything, updates, whatever else it might be, it's all going to be right here on Locked On Huskies. So make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. Please make sure to like the video, click that little bell so you never miss when we post more new stuff. We got so much more fun stuff coming, like I said. And if you got any questions, comments, concerns, drop a comment down below. If you're audio only, please leave us a 5-star review. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Wednesday.